Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Tuesday edition. I was going to say a beautiful Tuesday edition, and it indeed is a beautiful day. It was started out to be very cloudy, cold, and felt like snow, and I understand that's probably going to happen. But we have, however long this afternoon, we have sunshine, and it is absolutely gorgeous out. The winds have let up, and it's a beautiful day. It's a little bit brisk, but it is an absolutely gorgeous day. I left the Rotary meeting at 1 p.m. here in the East and drove home knowing that I was going to come on the air at 1:30 here at the Virtual Center. And as I approach the driveway, I just get more and more excited all the time because I know what I'm going to be doing for the next couple of hours, or hour and a half in this case. And I really, really do look forward to being with you, and I look forward to tomorrow's program as well. I'll mention in a moment what I think we'll probably be doing here at the Virtual Center tomorrow, the day before Thanksgiving. It is the 25th day of November in the year 2014. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Prior to the time we went on the air, Bob Kincaid and I were engaged in conversation about the whole issue of civic responsibility vis-a-vis what's going on in Ferguson, Missouri right now with the decision by the grand jury to not indict Officer Wilson and the reaction to that decision. And I'm not going to get into that here at the Virtual Center, but I think all of us are very, very aware of it. And Bob's point, and I think it's a point well taken, in looking at the issue of civic responsibility, it involves much more than casting a ballot. It involves the process, the justice system, whether it's working or not, how well it's working, whether in fact people have faith in it and trust that it will be fair, whether in fact the system appears to be colorblind or class blind or gender blind, and all of these other associated factors that really do go into an appreciation and understanding of the concept of civic responsibility. So again, welcome to today's program. Thank you for your willingness to give up some of your valuable time to tune in and hopefully do more than tune in, but actually participate in our program today. We do have a phone number that has been reserved specifically for an opportunity to give you the chance to share your ideas, concerns, questions, fears, hopes, whatever, with others here at the Virtual Center. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-HORN, H-O-R-N. If you'd like to communicate with me via email on some of these issues, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, B-R-I-E-N, 906, all one word, at gmail.com. Yesterday, we began to look at Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address delivered on the 4th of March, 1861. As we know, it was at a traumatic time for the nation because a number of states, southern states, were in the process of voting upon and approving secession ordinances, the state of South Carolina being the first one, based on Lincoln's election. So, and we did this in our second hour yesterday, and we'll hopefully complete it today. Obviously, Lincoln's challenge for his inaugural address was a key one. We are so used, in this country, we are so used to the idea that presidents deliver inaugural addresses, and what they tend to be is shopping lists and oftentimes unfulfilled promises, if you will, an agenda of this is what I hope we will do and this is why I hope we will do it. And every once in a while, a particular phrase or a particular issue captures the public imagination. I'm thinking specifically of President Kennedy's inaugural about ask not what you can do for your country, but ask what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That one's, I beat it up a little bit, but that one has become a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But Lincoln's inaugural was basically facing the monumental challenge of this union. And so Lincoln's inaugural address, it seems, if you put it into context, and we did that yesterday, seems to have been surrounded by an increased air of significance, if you will. Obviously, Lincoln approached this inaugural with the idea that if he was successful, he was going to be able to hold the Union together by reassuring the South that they had nothing to fear from a Republican administration or from an aggressive, invasive, intrusive federal government. On the other hand, there were certain principles and certain givens that were part of Lincoln's election and Lincoln's inauguration and the promise of Lincoln's administration. And so somehow he had to basically be true to where he stood and what he was elected on. At the same time, he had to do everything possible to reassure the South and encourage them with the idea that they had more to gain by staying in the Union and trying to work within the system, supposedly, within the Union, rather than withdrawing from it. And so it seems to me that the stakes in the success of this particular inaugural address were overwhelming. The other thing that I think makes this inaugural so very, very significant is the fact that it's Abraham Lincoln's. And I think that fact alone makes this extremely significant, because there's absolutely no question that Lincoln became, prior to the time that he was elected president and through his administration before he was unfortunately assassinated, President Lincoln became an astute, not only defender of the Union, but an astute supporter and advocate for the founders and the founding principles on which this nation was based. We have made reference a number of times to the fact that many people in today's world believe that Abraham Lincoln ought to be considered one of the nation's founders because he did so much to breathe life, if you will, into the vision and the ideals and the goals of the nation's founders. He basically believed, and of course one of the issues that brought this home to everyone was the contradiction between the Declaration of Independence and its commitment to free people with unalienable rights on the one hand, and the fact that Lincoln was elected president over a nation that continued to endorse and support the institution of slavery. So that inconsistency or contradiction itself, it seemed to me, would almost drive Lincoln to the need to become much more comfortable, if you will, much more knowledgeable about, and much better able to speak to the visions and the ideals of the founders, because it seems to me one of Lincoln's challenges would appear to be his efforts to resolve the institution of slavery on the one hand with the ideals and the values expressed by the founders in the Declaration of Independence on the others. So consequently, he did more to breathe life, if you will, into the Declaration than anyone else before or since, I believe. And many people indeed do believe that he has earned the right to be considered one of the founders because of what he has done for the principles included in the Declaration of Independence. I think that that the context of this particular address makes it extremely significant and extremely important. I also think that the strategy and the tactical nature of Lincoln, the way he organizes his inaugural address, the way he phrases his appeal to the South, the way he appeals to their sense of logic and common sense in proposing to them that their best strategy is to remain within the Union and continue to work toward achieving the kinds of goals that he assumes that all Americans subscribe to, which are the goals of the founders. However, as we know, Lincoln's inaugural address, at least from the perspective of persuading the South to stay in the Union and to not secede, was not successful. So I think we know that. Before we go back to Lincoln's inaugural and get into some of the strategies that he employed in trying to make his case, I wanted to mention a little bit about a program that I believe I'd like to at least make an attempt to begin tomorrow. Over the last 5 or 6 days, I've been rereading a book, and I use the word rereading advisedly. When it first came out, I read this book. It's written by Gordon Wood, and basically the title of the book is The Creation of the American Republic. And I don't have my copy right here that I can put it in my hands right now, so I can't tell you the exact date of publication. But I'm guessing that this book was probably written in the 80s or early 90s. Anyway, I don't have the book handy right now, so I'm not going to worry about that. Wait a minute. Yes, I do. The one thing I have here is books, and when you think you know all of the books, you turn around and there are more books. I have my hard copy. Actually, this is a copy that was signed by Gordon Wood, so it's very, very special to me. The publication date of this book is 1969. So it wasn't the 80s, it was 1969. A couple of years ago, in October, I think 2011, I believe, Gordon Wood gave a lecture here in West Virginia in Charleston at the Civic Center. And I, along with a colleague and close friend, Keith Lilly, that we did a number of the History Grant chats with, Keith and I drove up to Charleston for Gordon Wood's presentation. And it was an excellent presentation. Afterwards, Professor Wood did a book signing in the rotunda in the lobby area of the Cultural Center. And a number of folks obviously had the opportunity to purchase any number of books that Gordon Woods had written on this founding period, on the early history of the nation. And of course, the book that he gets most of his accolades for is The Radicalism of the American Revolution, which was a winner of the Pulitzer Prize. And that particular book, I have it in my hand as well, was written in 1991. Many people brought copies of Radicalism of the American Revolution so that Gordon Wood could sign their copies. I brought my hard copy of the 1969 book, Creation of the American Republic. And I had the honor, which actually is an honor, I don't know how many people think about it this way, but I do. I had the honor of telling Gordon Wood that the creation of the American Republic was one of the finest pieces of scholarship on the early history of this nation that I had ever read. And I also have the honor of remembering very, very well that Gordon Wood was a little bit taken aback by this because I was the only one talking about this book. Most people were talking about his Radicalism of the American Revolution or other books that he has authored since then. And I don't think he expected somebody to bring a copy of a book that he had written some 40 years ago. I remember when I first bought this book, written in 1969, it was during the early 70s. I was in graduate school at the time, and I was working on a dissertation, a master's thesis first, and then a dissertation. So consequently, it was very important to me. I read this book because it was germane to everything that I was doing. And I'll be honest with you, I was stunned. At the same time, I became a little bit intimidated and a little bit embarrassed by the book because it made me appreciate how little I knew about the period. And here I was writing a master's thesis. And in theory, if you're going to write a master's thesis, or lo and behold, after that, a PhD thesis, a doctoral dissertation, then the assumption is that you basically know the period. And I thought I did until I read this book. And I marked it, and I remarked it, and I put stars beside certain paragraphs. And I highlighted, and I underlined, and I folded pages over, dog-eared pages, in order that the book would open to this appropriate passage or appropriate issue or sentence or whatever. And the fact of the matter is, I beat that paperback copy of Creation of the American Republic to a pulp. When I finished reading it, it was pretty obvious that it had been read. I had made notes on the ending page of chapters where if the chapter ended halfway down a page or a third of the way down a page and there was a half or two-thirds of a blank page, I would make notes to myself about what was in that chapter and why I really thought it was so important. And I did this all the way through. And I wrote marginalia up and down, around, on the bottom, on the top of pages. The fact of the matter is, I thoroughly, more and more, I began to appreciate that book. As I continued to read more and more in the field, I began to realize just how good this book was. And so rather than saying to Gordon Wood that this is one of the finest pieces of early American scholarship, historical scholarship that I'd ever read, which I would have said when I first read it in the 1970s, when I said it in 2011, face to face with Gordon Wood, I really meant it. And by that time, I had some perspective and had developed the kind of historical sense where I could really appreciate just how good that book was. I've been meaning for the last several months to reread that book. Within the last week, I decided to do it. And I'll be honest with you, what caused me to do it was that for somehow, some way, I had misplaced the paperback copy that I had marked up. I actually believed that it was gone. I had looked for it and looked for it and looked for it in my bookshelves, in my study. I had looked for it in books I have stored upstairs in the attic. I had looked everywhere. Fortunately, I had a hard copy of the book as well, but it didn't have any underlining in it at all. And I said, in order to reread the Creation of the American Republic, I'm going to have to really read it for the first time because there's no notes, there's no underlining, there's nothing. I'm starting all over again. And then about 2 weeks ago, for some reason, I moved something And there was that paperback copy. As dog-eared as the cover was, I became all excited. And I opened the book, and there were all my notes and all my underlines and all my highlights and everything else. And I said, now I don't have an excuse anymore. I'm going to reread Gordon Wood's book. So for the last 5 days or so, I've been doing that. Since our last program last week, which was Wednesday, a week ago, I started that evening, and I reread the book. And I reread the first unit, the first section of the book, which is entitled The Whig Science of Politics. And if you'll give me a moment, I just want to share part one of Gordon Wood's book is entitled The Ideology of the Revolution. And in this first part, the first chapter is entitled The Whig Science of Politics. And within that chapter, he has it broken down into 6 units. The first unit is History and Reason. The second unit is the English Constitution. The third unit is Power Against Liberty. The fourth unit is English Corruption. The fifth, The Pattern of Tyranny. And the sixth, The Preservation of Principles. I reread that first chapter on the Whig Science of Politics. And I became so excited because I thought, here's a program for the Virtual Center. In almost 2 years, now we're moving into the 20th month that we've been doing programs here at the Virtual Center. And I had never addressed in a program the idea of the Whig Science of Politics. And I thought, my God, I ought to do this. It's really worth it. I wonder how many people out there who tune in regularly to the Virtual Center know anything about Whigs or what the Whig theory of politics is all about. Whiggism from the 17th and 18th century British history, for example. And I thought, I need to do that. I've been deficient. And then I read the second chapter of Gordon Wood's book, and the third, and the fourth. And so here I am, well over 2/3 of the way through the book. I started to make notes to myself as potential program topics. I stopped at 11 because what I've discovered is that Gordon Wood's book on creation of the American Republic, as good as I always thought it was, as good as I told him it was, finally is going to make it to the Virtual Center programs. And I am so excited about it. And let me just share with you, this happens to be, I have no notes here at all on this. This is right off the top. But last night in reading the last section that I've read of Gordon Wood's book, it was on the issue of republicanism during the Confederation period in the 1780s. And it pointed out a contradiction that I knew, but I really never thought to articulate. And that is the innate contradiction, I was going to say contribution, the innate contradiction between republicanism and capitalism. We spent quite a bit of time when we were dealing with Gary Wills's book, Inventing America, on the Declaration of Independence. We spent quite a bit of time on the idea of republicanism. We spent quite a bit of time on the faith and support that American theorists, American political thinkers gave to Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws and Montesquieu's ideas and theories about republicanism. We spent quite a bit of time talking about why Montesquieu believed that a republic had to be a small geographical area because there needed to be a reciprocal back and forth relationship between citizens and their elected representatives. Citizens had to be able to access the representative in order to make sure that the representative knew their position or their druthers on particular issues. The representative, on the other hand, had to be close to his constituents, because if he was going to fulfill the goals of representation, he was going to have to be able to speak, and speak articulately and well, on behalf of his constituents and their wants and needs. So Montesquieu believed that a republic had to be small. We talked also about the extent to which the Articles of Confederation, in its goal of ensuring the sovereignty of states as opposed to the sovereignty or the power of a central government, was based on the Republican model, was based on the idea that if republicanism was to have a chance of working, it had to be in a small area. Therefore, the states needed to be independent and needed to be sovereign. The theory, of course, was, or the thinking was, that each state, each individual state, in effect, was its own republic. But the fact of the matter is, realistically, we also knew, and I think we made reference to the fact, that theory's one thing, but reality is quite different oftentimes. And the reality of the 13 original states was that, with a few exceptions, like Rhode Island and Delaware and Maryland perhaps, most of the 13 original colonies, states, were pretty large. The biggest, of course, being Virginia. But then think about Pennsylvania, and think about New York, and think about how far west the Carolinas go, both North and South Carolina. And then think about Montesquieu's theory of republican government. And in theory, state sovereignty made republics possible. But in actual fact, there was no way that you could bring the theory of republican government to life in geographical areas this large. The only person in the 18th century that I saw take that on and say that specifically was Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers. He was adamant in pointing out that the fact of the reality was that, despite the fact that the Articles of Confederation was modeled on the ideals of republicanism, the reality was that very few states actually conformed to the realities of republicanism, because while they were small as opposed to the size of the total Union, all 13 colonies together, the fact of the matter is that in most cases they were much too large to allow republicanism to work as it was supposed to. And that became the jump-off point, as you'll recall, for Hamilton's argument that we really need to take Montesquieu a little bit further in order to address the realities of American politics in the 1780s. We dealt with a lot of that here at the Virtual Center. But what we didn't do, and I think it's past due time that we do it, excuse me, is to deal with the issue of republicanism as it would function in a real world. Specifically, the inherent contradictions between the ideals of republicanism on the one hand and the realities of capitalism on the other. Let me mention the most obvious contradiction, and then we'll pause and take a very short 2 or 3 minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll basically engage the balance of our program. with the completion of Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address. As we know, the key ingredient, Montesquieu's key ingredient in the idea of a republic, is the idea or the assumption about the value of citizenship, the values of citizenship, civic virtue, the need for a virtuous citizenry in order for Republican government to work. And the key ingredient of a definition of civic virtue is a willingness of individual citizens to put the public interest ahead of their own self-interest. In other words, to be willing to put their own self-interest, their own wants and druthers on the back burner by looking at what they want against the realities of what would be best for the entire republic. And from that, to be willing to suspend their own self-interest if it seemed to be in contradiction with the public interest. And the whole idea of civic virtue was to educate citizens into that particular willingness, into a recognition of the importance of the public interest and an appreciation of the idea that individual self-interest was best supported by focusing principally on the public interest. When the public interest was addressed and taken care of, individuals within the republic would usually find that their self-interest was rewarded as well. But on the other hand, capitalism is quite different than that, because capitalism puts the premium on individual self-interest. In fact, the assumption that drives capitalism is that if there is such a thing as a public interest, it is brought about only by free people pursuing their own self-interest. The assumption being that the public interest, if there is such a thing, is really the sum total of individual citizens being free to pursue their own self-interests. That the idea being that somehow, if people really were successful in pursuing their own self-interests, then this amorphous term that we identify as the public interest would take care of itself. It would be the natural product of the pursuit of self-interest. The fact of the matter is, part of the issue of winning the American Revolution, of pulling off a successful struggle for independence from Great Britain, was to convince the vast majority of citizens in this country that the objectives of independence were the creation of republicanism. That republicanism was the ideal. It was to be the outcome of independence. And that meant that the nation's priorities were linked directly to citizens' willingness to put the public interest ahead of their own self-interest, because that's what republicanism was about. People really believed that independence was going to produce a new world, a world in which equality was more real and more measurable and more possible than it had ever been before. The assumption was that we weren't going to have perfect equality, but the gaps between rich and poor were going to close, and whatever gaps there were between people in terms of income and wealth would be less, and society would generally become much more equal than it had ever been before. And that all the pretenses and all the cultural hang-ups associated with a class system in America would be gone. and people would be treated with respect no matter who they were, where they lived, how much money they had, or whatever. That was basically what the ideal of independence was about to many people. Well, the fact of the matter is, once we get into the 1780s and we're developing or trying to develop an economy that will recover from the war, from the costs of the war for independence, the development of an economy is producing more and more and making much more visible and much more prominent a group of aggressive business types, investor types, mercantile types, commercial interests, bankers, planters who are southern planters who are engaged in international commerce and trade. And these people who are doing very well expect to live accordingly. The fact of the matter is, a contradiction emerges in the 1780s between the ideals of republicanism and the realities of a developing American society. And the gaps which divide people between the well-to-do and the not-so-well-off become more and more visible. And many people become disillusioned and disenchanted because they believe the goals of republicanism for which the war was fought and which independence was supposed to produce. Many people genuinely believe that republicanism is increasingly unimportant to more and more people. The goals of independence are not being fulfilled. More important than that, in every single state, there are individuals, the most prominent individuals, the leaders in those communities and societies, who begin to adopt the pretenses of luxury and arrogance and power and cultural arrogance, I guess you could say. In today's world, we're talking about the difference between people who live in urban communities, excuse me, and those people who are increasingly choosing to reside in gated communities. The idea that the people who are doing well choose not to live too close to the people who aren't. And what we see during the period of the 1780s between independence on the one hand and ratification of the Constitution on the other is this growing gap and growing distrust between this nouveau riche, these people that are becoming rapidly wealthy in an increasingly commercial capitalistic world, and try to rationalize that in the face of the ideals or the goals of republicanism, and on the other hand, the disillusionment of the masses who begin to believe by the mid-80s that all this stuff about republicanism and putting the public interest first and treating everybody with respect and treating everybody as if they really mattered was just a lot of hooey. And that the revolution, or the cultural surroundings of the war for independence constituted nothing more than a hoax. We were led to believe that the world was going to be different, but the fact of the matter is it's no different than it was before. And you have this tremendous sense of disillusionment in America, and it becomes a key part of the story of American constitutionalism. In many cases, it drives thinking about the Constitution of the United States and how it ought to be structured. In a sense, it forms the cultural background for the movement for constitutional reform which produces the Constitution and puts an end to the Articles of Confederation. In effect, to bury the Articles of Confederation in the minds of many people is to bury all hope that the ideals of republicanism will ever be realized, ever even stand a chance of being realized. I think last night, as we, and I'm assuming many of you, I know I was, glued to the television set listening for the grand jury decision in Ferguson, Missouri, on whether in fact to indict Officer Wilson in the shooting down of Michael Brown some weeks ago in Ferguson, and of course witnessed the violence and the destruction associated with the grand jury's decision to not indict, that what we in effect are looking at, what we were seeing last night, is the 2014-2015 version of the disillusionment of those who believed that republicanism in all its ideals was possible with independence. I think what we were looking at last night is an example of disillusionment with our justice system. What I would like to begin to do is look at the Confederation period, beginning with tomorrow's program, with this idea of republicanism and its ideals and its goals as opposed to its realities in mind. Let's see how much we can learn about today's world by looking at the world of the 18th century that produced independence and produced the Constitution of the United States, and produced for a very, very short period of time in historical terms an effort under the Articles of Confederation to give republicanism a chance. What that meant, what republicanism really meant in real terms, what its ideals were all about, and what were some of the realities that brought down the Articles of Confederation. What caused nationalists like James Madison to sit down and put together a paper called The Advices of the American Political System and lay out the elements that were wrong with America in the late 1780s. And of course the Federalist Papers then were his explanation as to how the Constitution of the United States would fix these problems. I see the potential of at least a few programs here at the Virtual Center being focused in this area. I hope you'll tune in. I hope you'll contribute. I hope you'll pick up the phone and be willing to give us a call and share your thoughts on what I believe is critical to an appreciation and an understanding not only of the 18th century, but of the world we're living in today. Because the fact of the matter is, human nature remains human nature. My belief is that people today are no different in terms of the nature-nurture issues than they were then. I believe that there are today very, very idealistic people who dream about a world that can be better. And I think there were idealists in the 18th century who dreamed that same dream. I hate to think about the possibility that we'll ever reach a point in our world when there are not people with those kinds of dreams. So I invite you to tune into the Virtual Center tomorrow. We'll be beginning tomorrow at our regular time, which will be 1 p.m. in the East. And we'll have our full 2 hours to begin to look at some of these issues. But I think right now we are at 15 minutes after the hour, and we've got 45 minutes to do justice, or try to do justice, to Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural. In yesterday's program, we were able to get quite far into Lincoln's inaugural address. You'll remember that Lincoln began by quoting the standards which he argued really dictated what he could and what he could not do. Namely, that the platform of the Republican Party, of which he was the successful candidate, the platform of the Republican Party contained a resolution which guaranteed the independence and the freedom of each state to control its own domestic institutions according to its own judgments exclusively. And the same platform plank defined as lawless invasion any effort by any armed force of a federal government or another state to interfere with the rights and freedoms of individual states to control their own domestic institutions. And then he followed that with a quotation from the Constitution of the United States, which included the nation's obligation to assist slave owners recover runaway slaves, or so-called fugitive slaves. And then we saw Lincoln begin to address the nature of the Union. And his strategy is particularly, I think, innovative and ingenious. Basically, Lincoln argues that no government was ever created that included in its creation the mechanism or the means for its own destruction. Lincoln's position or thesis being that any government, any nation, any union assumes perpetuity, is created with the idea that it will last forever. He says it is implied, if not expressed, in the fundamental law of all national governments. Consequently, one can never expect to find the means of the destruction of this government within the instrument that creates it. And then he specifically relates to the Union and to the South's secession from that Union. And he acknowledges, even if we acknowledge the South's position that the Union is really a compact of free and sovereign states who freely join the Union and thereby ought to be able freely to unjoin the Union. Even if we acknowledge that to be true, which Lincoln does not, the fact of the matter is the only way to rescind the Union in those cases would be if all states seceded. Since the Union was created by all states, then the only way it could be uncreated would be for all states to secede from it. Consequently, Lincoln says, if only a few states choose to secede from it, it constitutes lawlessness. It constitutes rebellion against the will of the whole. So what Lincoln has done is claim the invincibility of the Union, but he's also made the point that even if we buy your theories of what the Union is about, the way you are going about it can't work. The only way that the Union could be dissolved by free and independent states is if all free and independent states who created it chose to uncreate it. And then he points out that the Union preceded the Constitution. The Union preceded everything else. He points out, he says, the Union is much older than the Constitution. It was formed, in fact, by the Articles of Association in 1774, when the states gathered at the First Continental Congress in 1774 and made the decision to work together. From that point on, the Union was a real item, an entity. Under the Declaration of Independence, Lincoln said it matured in 1776. Then the 13 states engaged in perpetual union in the Articles of Confederation in 1778. And finally, in 1787, one of the key objectives of the Constitution of the United States in the preamble was to form a more perfect union. Consequently, what Lincoln has done is point out that historically the Union precedes the states. If destruction of the Union by one or by a part only of the states be lawfully possible, Lincoln says, the Union is less perfect than before the Constitution, having lost the vital element of perpetuity. If we believe or argue that one or a few states can destroy the Union, then the perpetuity which was assumed in the creation of all states is lost. And this was the way we closed yesterday's program, with this particular paragraph. It follows, Lincoln says, from these views that no state, upon its own mere motion, can lawfully get out of the Union, that resolves and ordinances to that effect are legally void, and that acts of violence within any state or states against the authority of the United States are insurrectionary or revolutionary according to circumstances. What Lincoln has done is rationally lay out the theory which suggests that what the South is doing is rebellion. It is insurrection. It is not the right of individual states to withdraw from a union. It is rebellion against the wish of all the states who created the Union in the first place. Therefore, Lincoln says, I consider that in the view of the Constitution and the laws, that the Union is unbroken. And to the extent of my ability, I shall take care, as the Constitution itself expressly enjoins upon me, that the laws of the Union be faithfully executed in all the states. Doing this I deem to be only a simple part, a duty on my part, and I shall perform it so far as practicable, unless my rightful masters, the American people, shall withhold the requisite means or in some authoritative manner direct me to the contrary. I trust that this will not be regarded as a menace, but only as the declared purpose of the Union, that it will constitutionally defend and maintain itself. What Lincoln has done, I think very shrewdly and very strategically, has painted a picture which puts him, the Union, on the defense here. He has successfully made the South the aggressor. He has basically laid out a strategy which says no government creates itself with the idea that it'll ever be destroyed. The only way it can be destroyed is by the powers that created, which is the people of the United States. If a portion of that United States, a portion of that Union, chooses to leave it, the only interpretation we can create is that it is rebellion. And then Lincoln lays out his oath, his job as president, to defend the Union, and concludes by reassuring the South that they shouldn't see this as a menace. He's just doing his job. He has laid out a strategy which puts the South in the position of becoming the aggressor. What they are doing is insurrection or revolution against the Union, and his job is to protect it. And then he does indeed address the issue of aggression. He basically lays out the degree to which the South is indeed the aggressor. In doing this, which is defending the Union, there needs to be no bloodshed or violence, he says, and there shall be none unless it be forced upon the national authority. He has painted the South into a corner. He has given them no option except either to become the aggressor, threaten the Union, and thereby elicit the response which Lincoln insists he has no choice but to make. He has to defend the Union. The only other alternative the South has is to not secede and effectively surrender. When I gave this document to my class, the question I raised is that, on Lincoln's part, is that legitimate? In other words, did Lincoln create a situation which almost guaranteed that there would be a war, because he really gave the South no out, no option? The way he defined the situation, the way he laid out the context within which secession was happening, he gave the South two choices: surrender or initiate violence, bloodshed. Whichever you choose, it's up to you. Traditionally, studies of diplomacy suggest that the only way to avoid conflict and to reach some sort of compromise, some sort of negotiated position, is to leave your opponent an out, an option. Some way that they could do what you want, but at the same time be able to go back to their own constituency and claim that they won something. Lincoln does not create such an option, such a situation for the Confederacy. Therefore, does he make war inevitable? by denying the South any other option except total surrender. Wow. That's pretty heavy stuff. That's what you call strategic tactical graduate study. I would suggest to you that's Abraham Lincoln. Let me go on and finish this paragraph about the issue of aggression. Lincoln says, the power confided to me will be used to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government, and to collect the duties and imposts. But beyond what may be necessary for these objects, there will be no invasion, no using of force against or among the people anywhere. In other words, we have no intent to cause any bloodshed or any violence. In a sense, what he's saying is, if there's bloodshed, you're going to be responsible for it, not us. Where hostility to the United States in any interior locality shall be so great and universal as to prevent competent resident citizens from holding the federal offices, there will be no attempt to force obnoxious strangers among the people for that object. We're not going to go and import Hessians, if you remember the American Revolution, foreign mercenaries. Our goal here is not to win a war. Our goal here is to prevent one. But the fact of the matter is, the only way that it can be prevented is if the South forgoes its decisions to secede. Because Lincoln has successfully made the case that secession is rebellion. And then he says, and I think this is particularly interesting, there are persons in one section or another who seek to destroy the Union at all events and are glad of any pretext to do it. I will neither affirm nor deny that. But if there be such, I need to address no word to them. To those, however, who really love the Union, may I not speak. What Lincoln is doing is saying, I'm only talking to the people who love the Union, not the people who are committed to destroying it. I don't care about them. His appeal is to the people who don't want war, the people who recognize the value of the Union. And to those people, Lincoln speaks the following. Before entering upon so grave a matter as the destruction of our national fabric, with all its benefits, its memories, and its hopes, would it not be wise to ascertain precisely why we do it? Remember, he's talking to the people who love the Union. And he's saying, before you do this, before you take on the destruction of a Union with all of the benefits, memories, and hopes that we all understand come from it, shouldn't we at least be aware of why we're doing it? Will you hazard so desperate a step, Lincoln says, while there's any possibility that any portion of the ills you fly from here have no real existence? Will you, while the certain ills you fly to are greater than all the real ones you fly from, will you risk the commission of so fearful a mistake? And Lincoln is laying out to them and suggesting, if you love the Union, and if you don't want to make a mistake, then the best thing you can do is hang in there a little bit longer and see if we can find a way to fix this. Because the alternatives are a lot worse. All profess, Lincoln says, to be content in the Union if all constitutional rights can be maintained. Is it true, then, that any right plainly written in the Constitution has been denied? I think not. In other words, Lincoln is saying we all profess, everybody agrees, that the only way to be content in the Union is when all constitutional rights are upheld. And then he says, does anybody know of a right that's plainly written in the Constitution that's being denied anybody? And Lincoln said, I think not. Happily, the human mind is so constituted that no party can reach to the audacity of doing this. In other words, you have to go some in order to find an example of a right that's clearly written in the Constitution that anybody is threatening. Think, if you can, of a single instance in which a plainly written provision of the Constitution has ever been denied. If by the mere force of numbers a majority should deprive a minority of any clearly written constitutional right, it might, in a moral point of view, justify revolution. Certainly would, if such right were a vital one. But such is not our case. All the vital rights of minorities and of individuals are so plainly assured to them by affirmations and negations, guarantees and prohibitions in the Constitution that controversies never arise concerning them. So what Lincoln has done is say, show me a place in the Constitution of the United States where anybody's rights, a state's rights or an individual's rights, are being denied them. Show me. And then he says, talking about the Constitution, no foresight can anticipate nor any document of reasonable length contain express provisions for all possible questions. No document, Lincoln is saying, can cover all the contingencies because it would require that the people who drafted the Constitution can witness the future. There's no way we can do this. Shall fugitives from labor be surrendered by national or state authority? The Constitution does not expressly say. So Lincoln takes the issue of fugitive slaves. He quotes the passage in the Constitution which says that fugitive slaves will be returned. But then when it gets down to the debate as to whether it's the states that are going to return them or whether it's the federal government that's going to return them, Lincoln says the Constitution doesn't say that. May Congress prohibit slavery in the territories? The Constitution does not expressly say that either. Must Congress protect slavery in the territories? The Constitution does not expressly say. In other words, what Lincoln has done is take the key issues between North and South, the issue of runaway slaves, the issue of the expansion of slavery into the territories, and the role of Congress in that expansion. These are the debates. And he acknowledges that on those things we have to deal, we have to negotiate, because the answer is not definitive. And then he gets into the issue of minorities and majorities. From questions of this class spring all our constitutional controversies, and we divide upon them into majorities and minorities. If the minority will not acquiesce, the majority must, or the government must cease. What Lincoln is saying here is, given the differences between North and South, if one side or the other doesn't give in, the Union's done. There's no way to preserve the Union. There's no other alternative, Lincoln says, for continuing the government is acquiescence on one side or the other side. And then he gets to the issue of minorities and majorities. If a minority in such case will secede rather than acquiesce, they make a precedent which in turn will divide and ruin them. For a minority of their own will secede from them whenever a majority refuses to be controlled by such minority. What Lincoln is saying is, if one side or the other doesn't give in, we don't have a chance. But now he's saying which side ought to give in, the majority or the minority. And what he's saying, you can't expect the majority to give in. That would be crazy to let the minority make the decisions over the majority. So the logical conclusion is the South needs to give in because it's the minority. One or the other of us must give in. And because we're the majority, it shouldn't be us, it should be you, is what Lincoln is saying. And then he gets to, in the 1850s, late 1850s, one of the most controversial, heated issues of the entire decade, which is the Supreme Court decision in Dred Scott. Remember, the Supreme Court has already rendered its decision in Dred Scott. It has declared, and this is straight out of the history books, the Supreme Court has declared in Dred Scott that since Dred Scott, even though he lived in free territory, he lived in the territories of Wisconsin and Illinois, for 5 years. The fact of the matter is, he was a slave. And the fact that he was a slave means that he was not a citizen. And because he was not a citizen, he had no right to sue in the federal courts anyway, because the justice system, the court system, is there for the exclusive use of citizens. That's the first part of the Dred Scott decision. It could have ended there. The Supreme Court could have said Dred Scott's decision never should have even been heard in the courts because the case was filed by a slave, not a citizen. End of case. But the Supreme Court majority under Justice Taney of Maryland chose to go further in Dred Scott. Specifically, the court concluded, the majority concluded, that as a slave, Dred Scott was property. And for anybody to deny a property owner the right to take his property wherever he chooses to go is a violation of the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. You'll remember that the Fifth Amendment says that no person will be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And we know that the 14th Amendment, which was passed a few years after this, in the late 1860s, the 14th Amendment took that language from the 5th Amendment and applied it to the states. And much of the debate we've had is based on the use of the word person and whether in fact corporations are persons. Basically, what the Supreme Court said in 1857 is that Dred Scott was not a person, he was a slave. And now we have come all the way to the idea that corporations are persons. But Dred Scott was not? That's interesting. I wonder if anybody from Ferguson, Missouri is listening to the virtual center right now. Consequently, what the Supreme Court has done is put its stamp of approval on the idea that slaves are property, and thereby the slave owner's rights are protected under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. Therefore, this phenomenon that's running rampant during this period of the late 1850s, associated most directly with the name Stephen Douglas in the very famous Lincoln-Douglas debates for the Senate seat in Illinois. Douglas's position and advocacy is for a phenomenon called popular sovereignty, that the way to resolve the expansion of slavery issue is to leave it up to the voters in the territory involved. In other words, when a territory reaches the point where it is ready to apply for statehood, then the people in that territory can make the decision by majority rule whether it will be slave or whether it will be non-slave. That's popular sovereignty. That was the position that Stephen Douglas was arguing in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. What the Supreme Court is saying in 1854 is that since slaves are property and thereby the slave owner's rights are protected under the Fifth Amendment, therefore the concept of popular sovereignty is void, is null and void. If the slave owner's Fifth Amendment's rights will be detrimentally affected by a majority decision of the people in a territory to ban slavery, then the people cannot be allowed to make that decision. Since slaves are property, the majority of the people can't interfere with the freedom of the slave owner to take his property. And then you go back to Congress. Under the Missouri Compromise of 1820, Congress said that Missouri could come in as a slave state, but there would be no other slave states north of the southern border of Missouri, which was 3630. In other words, the Missouri Compromise opened up the so-called Northwest Territory. The Supreme Court's decision in Dred Scott, the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional the day it was written, because the people, by popular sovereignty, cannot interfere with a slave owner's freedom under the Fifth Amendment. Neither can Congress under the Missouri Compromise. Consequently, what the Dred Scott decision did in declaring slaves property and asserting the Fifth Amendment rights of slave owners to the freedom to bring their property wherever they choose to, that effectively meant that nobody, Congress, the majority of the people, nobody could stop the expansion of slavery because slaves were property. Effectively, what the Supreme Court had done is open up the entire continental United States to the institution of slavery. The South loved it. The North hated it so much that they elected the Republican majority in Congress and elected Lincoln, President of the United States. The election of Lincoln, no question, was aided and abetted, at least in part, by the Dred Scott decision. Yet Lincoln is not about abolishing the Supreme Court. Listen to what Lincoln says in his inaugural. I do not forget the position assumed by some that constitutional questions are to be decided by the Supreme Court. Nor do I deny that such decisions must be binding in any case upon the parties to a suit as to the object of that suit, while they are also entitled to very high respect and consideration in all parallel cases by all other departments of the government. While it is obviously possible that such decision by the Supreme Court may be erroneous in any given case, still the evil effect following it being limited to that particular case, with the chance that it may be overruled and never become precedent for other cases, can better be borne than could the evils of a different practice. What Lincoln is saying is, we have the right to change the membership of the Supreme Court in order to change that decision. We do not have the right to abolish the Supreme Court. We do not have the right to take on or challenge the constitutionality of the Supreme Court's right to make the decision. So as bad as Lincoln believes the Dred Scott decision was, he continues to defend the right of the Supreme Court to make such a decision. And what he said, if we don't like that decision, then we change the membership of the court and we come out with a different decision later on. The candid citizen, Lincoln says, must confess that if the policy of the government upon vital questions affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by decisions of the Supreme Court, the instant they are made in ordinary litigation between parties in personal actions, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers, having to that extent practically resigned their government into the hands of that eminent tribunal. Lincoln's issue here is the fact that the court went way beyond what it needed to do in order to interpret the Constitution. Lincoln's not saying this, but what he basically means here is the court's role as interpreter of the Constitution was Dred Scott was a slave. Therefore, since he was not a citizen, he had no right to take his case to court. Case closed. That's the interpretation of the Constitution. But Lincoln is saying the court chose to go way beyond that. The court chose to make law rather than interpret law. The court became activist. The court made the decision that the nation needed something further. So the court assumed its charge in this case to make it. It is the activism of the Supreme Court that Lincoln is challenging here, not its right to make a constitutional decision. He says, nor is there in this view any assault upon the court or the judges. It is a duty from which they may not shrink to decide cases properly brought before them. It's no fault of theirs if others seek to turn their decisions to political purposes. Now Lincoln is reaching his conclusion. One section of our country believes that slavery is right and ought to be extended, while the other believes it is wrong and ought not to be extended. This is the only substantial dispute, Lincoln says. What Lincoln is saying in this inaugural is that the issue precipitating the Civil War is the expansion of slavery. It's not slavery, it's the expansion of slavery. Lincoln says the fugitive slave law of the Constitution and the law for suppression of the slave trade are each well being enforced. Perhaps not perfectly, but they're being enforced. What happens if we allow the South to secede? The foreign slave trade, now imperfectly suppressed, would ultimately be revived without restriction in one section, while fugitive slaves, now partially surrendered, would not be surrendered at all by the other. In other words, what Lincoln is saying is secession would undo the Constitution because it would give new life to the slave trade and it would end the return of fugitive slaves. What he's saying to the South is, you have more to lose here than you have to gain by seceding. And then finally, Lincoln goes into the very fact that North and South are connected. They're part of the same continental unit. Physically speaking, Lincoln says, we can't separate. We cannot remove our respective sections from each other, nor build an impassable wall between them. We're connected. He said even a husband and wife can be divorced and can go out of the presence and on their separate ways. But different parts of the country can't do this. They cannot but remain face to face and constantly have an interactive relationship between them. We can't undo that. And finally, Lincoln says something else. I've got to get this in before we finish our program today. We are at 56 minutes. We've got about 2.5 minutes. And this is the issue of a constitutional amendment on slavery. Lincoln says, I cannot be ignorant of the fact that many worthy patriotic citizens are desirous of having the national constitution amended. While I make no recommendation on amendments, I fully recognize the rightful authority of the people over the whole subject to be exercised in either of the two modes prescribed in the Constitution. He said, I personally favor the convention system. I understand a proposed amendment to the Constitution, which amendment, however, I have not seen, has passed Congress, to the effect that the federal government shall never interfere with the domestic institutions of the states, including that of persons held to service. To avoid misconstruction of what I have said, I depart from my purpose not to speak of particular amendments, so far as to say that, holding such a provision to now be implied constitutional law, I have no objection to its being made express and irrevocable. Lincoln is willing to support a law, a constitutional amendment, guaranteeing the right of slavery to exist by name. Anybody who claims that to Lincoln the war was about freeing slaves is wrong. Lincoln, in this inaugural, admits that he's willing to go along with an amendment guaranteeing forever the right of slavery to exist within the states. It's the expansion of slavery that he's unwilling to allow. And then he concludes his address by urging those who love the Union to agree that their best strategy is to hold on and stay in it. Stay with us. But as we know, it does not work. I think that's an incredible document. At the beginning of tomorrow's program, we'll try to pull together what we think is the significance of that address before we get into some of this Confederation period stuff about republicanism. But right now we have to say goodbye. We're at 59 minutes after the hour. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, Civic Responsibility. This is Bill O'Brien. Please have a wonderful evening. Be safe. We look forward to being back with you again tomorrow, day before Thanksgiving. Thank you.